Hello, good to see you. I'm Claire Mulman here. Our website is cwowi.eu. Welcome. Today I want to finish the teachings about marriage, about divorce, about remarriage. And actually you can go to my YouTube channel, you can find more teaching on Facebook, and you can go to our website cwowi.eu and find a lot of articles there, and especially if you are interested or have a heart for relationship-based faith, because that's what we do. We do house church and we meet with other people who are on the same page, and that is really wonderful. But today is actually what I want to talk about. Could it be that the Apostle Paul was married? Maybe he was divorced, or was he a widower? And why do I think that? Well, actually, it's more fun. It's the last subject that I'm doing, here about marriage. So this last week I was just doing some word studies, and I'm not saying that what I share today is like the scripture. I'm just sharing something and want to know what you think about it. I did some word studies, and I think the Bible is not quite clear, but it could be, in my eyes, in my opinion, that he was married before, and he probably was a widower, or he was divorced. And when you go to 1 Corinthians 7 in verse 1, Paul says, "Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, is it good for a man not to touch a woman?" So Paul is definitely answering questions that the Corinthians had, and he is giving them advice, what he would do, what is wise to do, and what is not wise to do. It's the same in chapter 8. Here he says concerning the things offered to idols. So they had questions about can you eat meat that is offered to idols. In chapter 12 he says now concerning spiritual gifts. So they had a lot of questions, and Paul is answering their questions. Then he says some principles of marriage. Many people say, why does Paul say something about marriage? How can he teach us anything about marriage? Because he was never married. And they think so because of verse 8, 1 Corinthians 7:8. It says, Paul says, "I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it's good for them if they remain even as I am." So he says he's speaking to the unmarried and the widows. And he says it's good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it's better to marry than to burn with passion. And of course, that is very clear. It is better to marry than to burn with passion, okay? So marriage is advisable over lust or temptation. But what is less clear here in the Bible, when you say unmarried, it seems, when I think about unmarried, you think about probably someone who was never married, that could be. But he says here the unmarried and to the widows. So what does he mean? When you go to what that word means here in the Greek, it's the word agamos, A-G-A-M-O, again, A-G-A-M-O-S, agamos, and it's used only 4 times in the Bible, and each instance it is translated as unmarried. And all of those four times I found here in the 7th chapter of 1 Corinthians. And actually Paul is the only biblical author to use this term, and he only uses it here, and he uses it 4 times. So let's go to those 4 times. The first time was here in verse 8, yeah? And then you go to verse 10. He says, "Now to the married I command, yet not I but the Lord, that wife is not to depart from her husband. And even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled." The same word, unmarried. Agamos actually comes from the word gamos, is the word marry. Agamos is the word unmarried. So to become married, of course you must marry. And to become unmarried, one has to unmarry. So unmarried could be divorce, or unmarried could be a widower, okay? So verse 11 is the second time that he uses the term unmarried. Then we go to verse 32. He says here, "But I want you to be without care, and he who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord." So again, unmarried. And in verse 34, there's a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord. So he's talking about a wife and a virgin. Interesting, right? So here in this chapter, Paul is discussing people of different marital statuses, and under what circumstances it is advisable or inadvisable to change your marital status. Difficult word. So we can be expect that Paul is very specific in his word selection, and actually he is. So in one occurrence of the word agamos, unmarried, he is referring here in verse 11 to a woman who was married. He says, to the married I command, a wife is not to depart or leave her husband or divorce her husband, but even if she does depart, so if she does divorce him, let her remain unmarried. So here the word unmarried, agamos, definitely means divorced, right? Okay. Then in verse 34, here Paul is using again the word of agamos, and he says in verse 34, a wife and a virgin. He is not including those who have never married, because he adds and the virgin. So when agamos means one who was never married, he could not add the virgins, because the virgins are included. And then in verse 8, let's see, but I say to the unmarried and to the widows. Of course, Paul's use of agamos does not include widows, because he adds and to the widows. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows. Are you still with me? Okay? So you have to really study it for yourself. So in verse 11, let her stay unmarried or be reconciled. Agamos can only be read as speaking of someone who was divorced. So in this case, agamos means someone who was divorced. And in verse 8, let them unmarried and the widows, okay, it's referring to someone who has been previously married, is not married now, and is not widowed. So by process of elimination, that only leaves someone who is divorced. And that agrees. So when you think, okay, Paul, maybe he was divorced, could that be that you can marry again? Let's go to verse 27 and 28. It says, are you bound to a wife? And bound to a wife means, are you married? Do not seek to be loosed. Do not seek a divorce. Or are you loosed? Are you divorced from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry. So are you loosed? Are you divorced from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned. So even if you are divorced from someone and you want to marry, it's not a sin. Suppose that Paul was married. Suppose that he was divorced. That could set a lot of people free, right? Because maybe in your mind or maybe in your church, our teaching is that once that you are married and divorced, that is a shame. It's almost like the unpardonable sin, and the Lord can never use you in ministry. He can never use you, and you feel ashamed maybe yourself. But if Paul was married and divorced, the Lord uses him, right? So marriage, so to divorce is not the big sin. Of course, it's heartbreaking, and it's never intended, it was never God's intended that should happen, because a healthy marriage should reflect our relationship with the Lord, with God the Father and the Lord. So a happy marriage, that's everything, that's so much better. But there's always like a way of escape if a marriage doesn't work, if someone is not keeping the covenant, that he promised to take care of someone, to love and to hold forever. There is a way of escape. So it's interesting. See for yourself what you think. If Paul was probably married, was he divorced? Maybe he was a widower, that could be too. And then there's another case. So when I did some studies, some people refer to Acts 26, where he is, let's see, verse 9 and 10. He says, this I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints are shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priest. That was before he was born again. And when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. So casting your vote against them, that claim suggests that he was a member of the Sanhedrin, which was a role normally reserved for married men. So, could be. And there's something that could also be true when you go to Philippians chapter 3. In verse 5, what Paul mentioned about himself, he says, I was circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel. I was of the tribe of Benjamin. I was a Hebrew of the Hebrews, and concerning the law, a Pharisee. Paul was a Pharisee before he met the Lord, and being married was a requirement for being a Pharisee. So in my opinion, it's just, I'm not saying this is like the word, this is scripture, this is how to say doctrine. I'm just studying about it, and I think, okay, it could very well be that Paul was married indeed, and maybe he was divorced, because the word marry is gamos, and divorced or unmarried is agamos, and you know the a means not. So first you have to be married to be unmarried, to get unmarried. Okay, just some thoughts, just some ideas. Let me know what you think about it, and then I'll see you next week again with another subject. Bye bye.